This past Wednesday, the presidents of Iran, Russia, and Turkey met to discuss the latest situation in Syria. The talks, as the Russian President Vladimir Putin later told reporters, had opened a new stage in efforts to resolve the 7-year crisis in the country, a crisis that has taken multiple thousands of lives, displaced millions, destroyed a nation, and affected many other countries. Iran, Russia, and Turkey at the end of their meeting said that they would push hard to find a political solution to the crisis. The next step in the same direction would be to hold a Congress of a national dialogue, and all warring sides would be invited to participate in the Congress, which could take place within the next few days.
I can state with satisfaction that the presidents of Iran and Turkey welcomed the idea of convening a pan-Syrian forum, a Syrian National Dialogue Congress. It's been agreed to arrange for this most important event at the proper level and to ensure participation in it of the widest strata of Syrian society. The foreign ministers, special services, and defense ministers were instructed to work on a date and composition of the Congress to be held here in Sochi.
What we're seeing now is really the end of the war. The Russians have made it absolutely clear that this is of strategic importance to them as a superpower. And it's been interesting to see how the bases in Tarsus and elsewhere in Syria from the Russians have been protected by what the Russians have done. I think the Russians have realised that if they were to be pushed out by a new regime, a new government in Syria, that this would completely unbalance the world power balance, and we would start to see massive encroachment of the West, NATO forces in the Middle East, which would be a disaster.
Syrian opposition groups also held a meeting in the Saudi capital. At the same time, the meeting was taking place between Iran, Russia, and Turkey in Sochi. They called on the UN in their final statement at the end of their meeting to activate the political process for a dialogue between them and representatives of the Syrian government. But they insisted that the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad should play no role in any effort to bring peace to the country. It appears that the fate of President Assad is the main sticking point in efforts to resolve the Syrian crisis. President Assad himself has not indicated so far that he would step down. To the same degree, Russia has clearly called the future of Syria that it should be decided through elections and the formation of a new constitution.
Well, this demand that Assad leaves power, I'm afraid, is totally unrealistic and actually illegal under international law. It's for the Syrian people to decide who runs their country, not for the so-called rebels. And what we've been hearing and seeing is massive backing from outside for these rebels. For many of them are mercenaries, simply mercenaries. As the so-called opposition, the so-called rebels, sponsored by the West, lose the battle because what's happened is the Russian superpower has come in to back President Assad in fear of losing its really important bases in Syria. To keep that part of the world stable, we need a balance of power. The Russians need to be there, not just the American influence. And so the HNC has been falling apart because the war on the ground is falling apart. The West is starting to withdraw its support for these fanatics and for these mercenaries.
One important issue that still remains to be addressed over Syria is the fate of the country's Kurds. Strongly supported by the United States, they've already created a self-governed region in Syria's north. Turkey had already made it clear that it does not want to see a Kurdish state formed in its southern borders. This is also nothing that Iran desires to happen due to its own strategic considerations. The fate of the Kurds may have therefore already created a paradox of interests in efforts to resolve the Syrian crisis. This is specifically the case when considering that the Russians, together with the Americans, support them. Despite differences that exist among the parties involved in the Syrian crisis, it appears that efforts to resolve the crisis in the country are drawing to success closer than at any other time. It is still not clear how those efforts would proceed. The world specifically wants to know what would be the fate of President Assad, whether Syria would be disintegrated, and if the Kurds would form their own state in Syria's north.
The dire humanitarian situation continues in Myanmar's Rakhine state and in Bangladesh, where thousands of Rohingya Muslims have taken refuge. The refugees have fled a deadly crackdown by the Myanmar army, which has left large numbers of Muslims dead. The victims of the atrocities include Rohingya babies, children, women and the elderly. The army forces commit widespread rape against Rohingya women, loot houses and burn down villages. The European Rohingya Council has called the situation in Myanmar, quote, slow-burning genocide. The latest UN figures show an estimated 620,000 Rohingya Muslims have fled Myanmar's Rakhine state into Bangladesh since August 25, and the number of the displaced keeps increasing.
Well, recently, today actually, we've seen Bangladesh and Myanmar sign a relocation agreement. The Myanmar government say they're going to allow 300 Rohingya refugees to come back into Myanmar every day. I mean, that'll take decades for them all to come back. But this is a charade, effectively. This is just a ploy by the Myanmar government to make them look good in front of the international community. I was recently in Bangladesh in the refugee camps there. 500,000 Rohingyas have fled Myanmar. How do you get 500,000 people to leave their homes where they've lived all their lives? You commit some of the most heinous crimes that we've seen this century, the massacring of civilians, indiscriminate shooting into villages, raping of women, mutilation of bodies. That's how you get 500,000 people to flee. So the Rohingyas I spoke to are scared, they're terrified to go back to Myanmar, and they need guarantees of security. And it's clear the international community and the Myanmar government cannot give that guarantee of security.
The plight of the Rohingya Muslims has once again laid bare what many see as the US double standards and its hypocrisy when it comes to the issue of human rights.
Well, the United States isn't standing up for the Rohingyas very strongly. I mean, they have condemned it, they have said that it's ethnic cleansing, so at least that's something. But they're not standing up willing to do anything about it. I mean, America is concerned about other things around the world, the Middle East, North Korea. But even if they were concerned enough about Myanmar, they wouldn't do anything, or they're not doing anything.
US Secretary of State Rex Tillerson visited Myanmar on November 15th and met with Myanmar's de facto leader Aung San Suu Kyi and its military chief Min Aung Hlaing. During his one-day stay, Tillerson said he would not advise broad-based economic sanctions against Myanmar. Now he has admitted that the crackdown on the Rohingya constitutes ethnic cleansing. Tillerson threatened penalties for Myanmar military officials who are involved in the brutal crackdown. But the threat has yet to translate into real action, as Tillerson has said the US will consider imposing targeted sanctions on individuals, not the government of Myanmar, which is called the main culprit.
Well, they're not putting sanctions on Myanmar, the Americans, because it's simply not in their interests to do so. There's a lot of money, natural resources in Myanmar, and the world powers are competing over to get a piece of that pie. And it's not just the Americans, of course, it's also the Chinese, the Indians. They have big interests in the country as well. So that's the big problem for the Rohingyas, that, as the UN said, they're the world's most persecuted group. And why are they? Because it's in no one's interest to help them. There's also, particularly where the Rohingyas are living in Rakhine State, there's a lot of resources there. So there's a number of commentators or researchers suggesting that that's another reason why they're being cleansed from those areas, because where they're living, there's some very valuable land.
The US has a long history of using the issue of human rights and democracy as a tool and for political leverage. Washington has largely kept silent on rights violations, even if they are widespread, by regimes which are its allies. It has, however, tried to put pressure on countries which are on its blacklist for the same reason. Myanmar is not an ally of the US, but it would not be in Washington's interest to meddle in the country's internal affairs by turning word into action. Myanmar is somehow supported by China. Beijing and Washington enjoy good ties, and now any effort by the US to pressure Myanmar would be damaging to ties with China.